Thank you, Robert. It's a pleasure to be introduced by my Hopkins colleague. It's a pleasure to be at this briefing. I'm going to talk to you about, first, something I'm going to call the marriage gap, something that's really new in American history in the last few decades. Here is a chart that shows you the percent currently married in a first marriage for people in their late 40s or early 50s a few years ago. Technically, it's the percent currently in a first marriage from the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth, funded by the Bureau of Labor Statistics and the National Institute of Childhood, NICHD, National Institute of Child Health and Human Development, the Eunice Kennedy Shriver National Institute of Child Health and Human Development. And so this is when these people in this survey were in their late 40s or early 50s. How many of them were currently married? And what you see is 4 bars. Each bar is for a particular educational group. And what you can see comparing the bar on the left with the much higher bar on the far right is that the percentage currently married is double among college graduates in this group than it is among people who never graduated from high school. And in fact, even people who have a high school degree but not a full college degree have a substantially lower percentage married than do those college graduates. Back in the 1950s, everybody got married. You know, most poor people were married, most wealthy people were married, most people without a lot of education were married, most people with education were married. Today, marriage is much more of a class-based issue, and I want to talk with you more about that. But first, let me ask, why would we care about the marriage gap? Well, what really motivates a lot of my research is a concern about the well-being of American children. And I think what American children need is a stable home environment. It doesn't have to be a married couple environment, although that tends to be a very good way of doing it. But children need stability. And marriage is the way that Americans tend to do long-term stable bonds. We also have in the US a lot of cohabitation. And if this were Sweden or France, I wouldn't be concerned about cohabitation from the perspective of children's well-being, because in France there are cohabiting relationships that last decades. The president of France was in a cohabiting relationship that lasts decades. He had several children. The French don't care. Can you imagine an American political candidate with that history right now? It's not a problem for them. In Sweden, they're long-term cohabiting relationships. We don't tend to do that in the US. We have the shortest duration of cohabiting relationships of any wealthy country. Our cohabiting relationships are more likely to break up than are people in any other country. This is the percent of cohabiting relationships disrupted after 5 years for a number of countries. That is to say, we saw you cohabiting, we came back 5 years later. Whether or not you married in the interim, are you still together? You can see from the bar at the bottom that the percent who have disrupted in the United States is far higher than any of the others. The last bar down is the highest one. It's data that comes from the National Survey of Family Growth, conducted by the National Center for Health Statistics, a very valuable source of information about family formation. And it shows American cohabiting relationships break up faster, which means we have lots of family instability. In fact, what all of the cohabiting breakups and the fairly high divorce rate mean for American children is there's much more churning, much more instability as parents and parents' partners go in and out of their homes than in other wealthy countries. For example, I want to show you the percentage of children living with their mothers who experience 3 or more maternal partnerships by age 15. What do I mean by that? I mean, you're born into to a single mom, a guy moves into the house, he moves out, mom marries a second guy, he's in the house, he moves out, third guy moves in, all by the time you're 15. Or you're born to a married couple and 2 more guys come in. How often does that happen? Well, it turns out in some countries it barely happens at all. Here is a chart, and at the bottom is the number for Belgium, which is 0.1, which means 0.1% of Belgian children experience this much turnover. That's 1 in 1,000. Basically doesn't happen. As I go up the chart, we'll find that in France, 0.5% of all kids have 3 partners moving in and out by the time they're age 15. When we get up to New Zealand and Germany, we find in those countries, 1% of all children have that much turnover. Sweden is the highest country in Europe, where 2.8%, 2.6% of children have that much turnover. In the US, 8.2% children have that much turnover. We have much more churning, much more turnover in the households of kids, and therefore much less stability for American children than do people in other countries. So we are a place that has lots of instability, which is probably not good for kids, we don't think, and which is much more prevalent here than in other places. Now, let me talk about that a bit more in terms of both cohabitation and marriage. What many people don't realize is that while the percentage of children, the percentage of mothers who are unmarried when they give birth has gone up, nearly all of that increase has been from mothers who aren't unmarried, but they're cohabiting. They're counted as unmarried in the simple statistic that says what percentage of children are to unmarried mothers. There's not been much of a rise in the percentage of children born to purely single moms without partners. It's been high for a while, but it hasn't changed very much. The big movement over the last few decades has been a huge increase in cohabiting couples who are going ahead and having kids. We know that a surprisingly large number of unmarried women who give birth are cohabiting. We know that from the Fragile Families Study, funded in large part by NICHD, a very valuable source of what happens when you go to hospitals and sample several thousand births and ask their parents questions. One of the big new findings from the Fragile Families results was that 51% of all unmarried parents' relationship at birth with their partner is that they are cohabiting. That's the blue wedge. Okay, so in half of these unmarried moms giving birth, who we sampled right at the hospital, they were cohabiting with the partner. This became known in family policy circles as the magic moment. My goodness, they're cohabiting. Why, we could get them married. I mean, maybe we ought to just fly in a priest, a minister, and a rabbi into the delivery room. Turns out the magic moment was really the magic millisecond. Because when you look 5 years later, you find that half of the cohabiting couples were no longer living together. You find that 3/4 of the couples who were in visiting relationships were no longer together. And you find that by the child's 3rd birthday, 2/3 of the mothers had experienced at least one partnership change, more than 1/3 had experienced at least 2 changes, and nearly 20% had experienced 3 or more changes. So this group of cohabiting moms and their partners did not marry in large numbers at all, and became part of the churning, the turnover in kids' lives. And all of this turnover creates great family complexity. Family complexity when parents' relationships break up, they get new partners and start having children with the new partners. Here from the Fragile Families Study is a study of the prevalence of what demographers call multi-partnered fertility. That is, having partners with more than one person during your adult life. What's the prevalence of that? The circle on the left, the pie chart on the left, says figure 1, prevalence of multi-partnered fertility among unmarried couples. So among all the unmarried couples who were giving birth when we found them in the hospital, in what proportion of the time was this the first partner for both of them? You know, neither had had a kid with a previous partner. That's the darkest wedge in the pie chart on the left, and you can see that it's less than half, it's 41%. So more than half of the unmarried parents giving birth in American hospitals in the year 2000 were in a situation where at least one of them had had a birth with a different partner. 20% were in the case that let's see, the largest wedge is 41%. Then the 22% father has multiple partner fertility only. 17% mother had it only, 20% both. On the right, you see the same pie chart for the couples who were married when they gave birth, and you can see that they're far more likely to be in a situation where neither has had a partner before. So the point of this chart is not the exact numbers, but the large number of unmarried partners who are having children with more than one person, creating much more instability in children's lives. So there's more instability and much more complexity, and there's also a great deal of family inequality. Getting back to my remarks about the marriage gap. We see a strong difference in family life by children's parents' education. In fact, in terms of family life, the closest thing we have to a class barrier in the US right now is a 4-year college degree. Strikingly different family lives going on for the people with 4-year degrees compared to everybody else. From the perspective of children, here's how we can show that. This is the percentage of children living with unmarried mothers according to their mother's education from 1980 to 2010. So think of all kids living with mothers who have college degrees. What percent of the time is that mom unmarried? In 1980, it's a little less than 10%. In 1990, it doesn't change very much. In 2000, it doesn't change very much. In fact, there's been very little growth in the percentage of college-educated moms who are unmarried. College-educated mothers are waiting until after they marry to have their kids. 90% of them do. So we don't find much of a growth in kids living with single moms or cohabiting moms among the college graduate population of moms. But among kids living with moms with a high school degree or some college, there's been a great increase in the percentage who are unmarried. This chart shows that a kid living with a high school educated mom now is far likely to have that mom be unmarried than was the case 30 years ago. The greatest changes have occurred for this high school graduate group. That's where we've seen most of the increase in non-marriage and most of the increase in family instability. For kids living with moms with less than a high school degree, they've always had the highest proportion living of being unmarried. Not as much change recently, but a high level. But those blue bars, which shows you kids living with single moms who are college graduates, are so low that it's almost like they've wandered in from another graph. They're so much lower than the other graphs and the other bars in back of them, suggesting that there's a huge difference now in family life for the college-educated kids who are far more likely to be living with two married parents than are kids with less education. This is a similar chart for non-whites, which shows again that college-educated parents are far different and far less likely to be unmarried. So kids living with college-educated moms are much less likely to be living with an unmarried parent. So a very sharp class differences. People with a college degree are marrying later, but they are marrying. They're waiting until after they marry to have kids, whereas most everybody else these days is going ahead in larger numbers and having them beforehand. And the divorce rate has gone way down for the college graduates, but not for people with less than a college degree. There's a new, more stable relationship going on here among the college grads. My take is the college grads are the people who are in some sense the winners in our globalized and automated economy. These are the people who can still get 2 decent jobs. And they're increasingly waiting to get married because they can see a future in which they will get married, investing in themselves, getting better jobs, going to graduate school, waiting longer to marry, and putting off having kids until after they marry, at which time they combine 2 decent incomes and have a marriage with a stable floor, which is a big reason why they're divorcing much less than their parents. Everybody else is much less sure they see a future that involves marriage. They're much less sure they'll find a partner who in fact does have the wherewithal to make a good marriage going. And because of that, in some sense, they're more willing to go ahead and have kids without that marriage, because having kids is important, and they're not sure they see the basis for a stable relationship in what they do. So a huge difference there in what happens. I may save to the question period the answers to some frequently asked questions. What difference or not does it make if children live with 2 parents or not? I have time to say that our best research suggests that the effects of not living with 2 parents are larger on emotional problems than on cognitive development. It doesn't seem to affect how kids do in school as much as their behavior problems. And that the effects seem to be larger for boys than for girls. There are some research now suggesting now that the effects of living in a single-parent family are larger for boys than for girls. What are the effects of divorce and cohabitation on adults? Well, the economic effects of divorce on women have long been negative, but they've declined a bit because women now have better earning potential. And they can do better after a divorce than they could in the past. While cohabiting mothers have increased in numbers, and the economic effects of the breakups of their unions have increased as they've become almost like married couples now. And the cohabiting mothers at the end of their relationships have a more difficult time reconnecting with the labor force. Finally, what are the benefits of marriage for men and women? A big topic. Well, marriage seems to provide men with a boost in earnings and health. It's controversial because We can't do a random experiment where we assign some people to marry and some not. But I think it's pretty clear that it is a boost in earnings and health for men, but that the benefits are much smaller for women. I'm not saying it's bad for women, but clearly the benefits go mainly to men. Thank you.